Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live broadcast this morning. My name is Gord Bickman, and I'm the podcast manager here at Strategic Coach. I'm here with the founder of Strategic Coach, Dan Sullivan. And today we're really happy you're with us because we're going to be talking about podcasting as a wildly effective and also inexpensive marketing tool. So welcome, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Gord. And, I want to put out a kudo to Joe Polish of Genius Network, because about 8 years ago, Joe talked to me and he said, podcasting is where it's going. And Joe is just a genius at marketing, and he's really in touch with, the latest developments, especially those that are assisted by the latest technology. And so we got going, and I found I really liked it. Actually, I kind of went wild, and I said, well, I'll do a podcast with this person, I'll do a podcast with that person, I'll do a podcast. And, I'm a front stage guy, and meanwhile, the backstage was getting very complicated. So a year ago, we went through a really, really careful specifying who could come in and manage all the complexity of our podcasts, and you applied, and it's been fantastic. The last year has just been fantastic. The skill that you brought to us, because you had really, really extensive experience in radio. And actually it's podcasting which is causing radio to totally have to rethink its entire model.
Yeah, they've really disrupted the whole space, and a lot of the experts are saying that podcast advertising is actually going to be greater than the advertising on traditional radio. It's going to flip. So if you stick with us throughout the broadcast today, we're going to be talking about podcasting, but more specifically, how podcasting can help you grow your brand, how it can help you bring the right prospects to your company, and how you can turn those prospects into paying clients much more simply than you ever thought possible. Earlier, the segue into Joe Polish is a great place to start, because Joe was the one who introduced you to the medium. And I wanted to ask, did you have any inkling what it was going to be like? Did you think you were just having fun, or did you have some sense of how effective these were going to be to accomplish your goals here at Strategic Coach when you first started?
Well, I think, first of all, it took some getting used to, because I didn't really realize the global impact of podcasts, because I'd done a lot of recordings in my life, but these were tape recordings and then cassette recordings and then CD recordings. But it was still, you had to do the sending out, And what surprised me was that, unlike radio, which is restricted basically to regions or local regions, podcasting, the moment that you record, and you can do it live, it just goes global, because it's the internet, what we're taking advantage here of the internet. And actually, Gord, to a certain extent, what we're doing on Facebook Live can be compared to podcasting, because we're the one who chose the time for the Facebook Live, so we were in control of the time when it's going to happen. And some of our podcasts are actually not only audio podcasts, but they're also video podcasts. And so this is kind of similar, but we can do it when we want it. We can send it out when we want it. And so the freedom that you get, and in Strategic Coach right now, the big breakthrough for us in our 30th year. So on November 13th, we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Strategic Coach workshop program for entrepreneurs, successful, talented, ambitious entrepreneurs. And it's right at this time that we've entered a whole new realm that we call the free zone frontier. And I was thinking about podcasts. Podcasts in the world today is really a free zone frontier. Anyone who's got anything to say, and they have an audience to say it to, at very low cost, I mean, it's almost negligible how much it costs to do this, you can create yourself a global radio station. Yeah.
And that's basically what we've done here at Strategic Coach. We currently have 11 shows, and you can find them all at strategicpodcasts.com. And that's a great way to lead us into kind of the meat of what we're going to be talking about here, Dan. So I came up with 5 reasons why podcasts are amazing marketing tools for entrepreneurs. So we can just go through these, and then I'll get your thoughts on some of them, if that makes sense. So you brought this up earlier, but we can sort of dig a little bit deeper into it, is that your message and your story reach prospects globally. And you've had some examples and some instances of people who have heard about Strategic Coach and made some contact and entered the program from some places that we never even thought possible.
Yeah, well, I have a really interesting story, and that was with Joe Polish. We have a podcast called 10 Times Talk, and we've been going for 8 years, so we have hundreds of episodes. And we found out after a while, because you can actually find out where people are listening from, that we found out that Joe and I had a real big fan club in Kazakhstan. And apparently there was kind of almost like a club that got together and listened to 10 Times Talk, and then they would talk through. So the thing is that you're constantly surprised by who is listening to your podcast. But the one that you're talking about that really surprised me. So our clients for Strategic Coach increasingly come from all over the world. So last Friday, and I was in Chicago. We have a program that we do in Chicago, and we had someone from Singapore, we had someone from Budapest, Hungary, and we had someone from Santiago, Chile. Generally speaking, the ones who come from a long way, their first contact with us is really a podcast. And they hear a podcast. And then the neat thing about podcasts is that you may be doing your 50th episode of the podcast, but when someone comes across it, every podcast you did is brand new to them. So podcasts are always brand new to the person who is just experiencing it. It's not like last year's radio program. And usually they'll reflect what's going on, in the news or anything like that, and they're dated, so it's not interesting listening to old radio broadcasts. But podcasts, which are usually, it's about a particular topic, you can very narrowly focus it. But I had 3 entrepreneurs who found out that they lived within 20 miles of each other in Mumbai in India, and they met at the Strategic Coach program, and each of them discovered that they had come across Strategic Coach by listening to the podcast. I have another one with Peter Diamandis, which is called Exponential Wisdom about Technology. So one of them had come through that podcast. The other 2 came from my podcast with Joe Polish. And I was just sitting there, and I said, "Man, what a world!" You just can put out messages to like-minded people, and like-minded people, they form a community, so you can form a community this way. And this is just the greatest kind of marketing in the world. And as it turns out, sales.
We're going to take our first question from Facebook now. We see that they're rolling in. So, Suvi?
Brian wants to know, do you have to have interviews on your podcast in order for them to be successful, or can you use your own content?
Both ways, because I have Strategic Coach. We have 4 podcasts in the top 100 marketing and business podcasts on iTunes, and 3 of them are where I'm interviewing. So I have Peter Diamandis, I have Joe Polish, and then we have one called Inside Strategic Coach with Shannon Waller. But I have another one called Mindset Multiplier, and Multiplier Mindset. I gotta know what I'm actually doing here. But you see here, I just made a mistake on a podcast, and that's just part of the culture and text on because it's informal. It's informal, but that's one. I just have podcasts that might be 5 minutes long or 8 minutes long. The podcast that Gord and I have, where we really go in depth. But the 2 things we established in the very first podcast that we did, Brian, this is an answer to your question. First of all, you have to have really something to say to somebody out there. So, you have to be confident that you have something really good and really valuable to say. That's the first thing. And the other thing is that you have to actually like the people that you're sending.
Speaking to.
You can't send bad messages out. You just won't attract an audience. You have to be a good person, and you're a good person. I'm a good person, but we have a lot to say about this, and we know that there's a lot of people out there that they would really like to know what we're discovering, because we're actually pioneering. Everybody in the podcast world is pioneering, and they're charting out new territory. And you just returned from Orlando, where the big podcast conference, and you could really see how much these are the early days, and people are charting out whole new territories in this world.
Yeah.
But if you've got something and you want to talk about it. Now, Brian, I will tell you one thing, and Gord, I think you'll probably back this up. If you read it, they won't be interested, okay? But if you can just talk to the talk as if someone is listening in a normal conversation, that'll be much more interesting than if you read it.
It's all improv, and the answer is always yes.
Yeah.
So thanks for your question, Brian. I hope we answered it sufficiently. And We're going to move on to the second point of why podcasting are fantastic marketing tools. And Dan, this brings in one of the newest coach concepts here of who, not how. So it's not as hard as you think to get started. And we get a lot of questions from coach clients and people who are just trying to get into the space. And they say, well, how do I do this? How do I set up the studio? How do I? And then the concept of who, not how has been transformative for you in taking this network from its infancy of one show with Joe Polish to the 11 that we have now. So if you could start off with the concept of who, not how, and then how you use that to build the network by finding the who's to do the hows and fill in all the blanks of the things that you didn't know how to do.
Yeah, and what I would say, and a lot of people who are very interested in the podcast world, they have a business, they have a product that they're really passionate about, and they already have a network of customers or prospects. So my feeling is that your first audience, you would just direct the podcast out specifically to the audience you already have, and then be open to the feedback, both where people say, I would really like you to hear more about this topic. And basically, it's a relationship with the world. So I always consider myself 50% of the partnership, and the audience is the other 50%. And they will provide me with ideas. And they say, I didn't think you really did this really clearly. And that's really good for me, because I'll say, well, if it was clear, how would I have approached it? And then they're in a teaching position to me. So I'm both someone who's ahead of them, but then I'm getting the feedback from the audience. So I love this interactivity, and it's happening right now, as it's happening right here on Facebook Live. You got to be open to other people having creative ideas for you, and then they start feeding you creative ideas. But you have to be the first out. You're the one who has to get in the pool first, and then you can have a pool party, and everybody else will jump in the pool. But you really have to have some commitment and courage for the first period, and then you'll develop capability and confidence from doing it. The secret to any new thing is you have to be committed to doing it, to go through the early nervousness and the early discomfort of doing it. And so that's courage, and then capability will develop, and then you'll become more confident.
Back to the viewer questions. We have one more. Suvi?
Nicole would like to know, where else do you publish your podcast? iTunes, your website?
I can take that one.
Yeah.
So we have a homepage, obviously, strategicpodcasts.com, and that is where all of our shows live. That is our network page. And then we publish anywhere that you get your audio. We are on iTunes, we are on Google Podcasts, we are on Stitcher, we are on Spotify, we are on iHeartRadio. Essentially, there are a lot of podcast players right now, and it may get a little confusing because it seems like there's millions of places to go and get them, and that's true. But if you are publishing a show, a lot of these players will actually pull directly from iTunes. iTunes is sort of the beast in the space. So if you publish to iTunes, which probably 80% of the traffic globally right now comes from iTunes. Google, you would think they're a little bit bigger than they are, but they're not. And then all of the other players pull from iTunes. So if you hit the big four, that would be my suggestion, would be iTunes is a can't miss. Google, Spotify, Stitcher, that's where I would start. Mm-hmm. And we have one more question.
Vlad would like to know, how do you decide on the podcast topics?
This leads very beautifully into a discussion of the impact filter, Dan, and how you use that to structure your shows. So could you let people know a little bit of the history of the impact filter and how you use that to make sure that everyone's on the same page before you go into the studio?
This is a impact filter that Gord did to set up the show, because he's the host of the show. This is a tool that we have in Strategic Coach. And actually, one of the books that we have in our series is called The Extraordinary Impact Filter, because this is the way to set up any project. And if you want to set up a project and get other people's teamwork, I always create this document. But basically, you say, well, this is the project, and the purpose is to tell our audience today about podcasts. And the importance is because this is probably the fastest growing communication platform in the world right now. And then the ideal outcome is that everybody who tunes in just gets a lot out of this, and it sparks their interest to go much further with podcasts. Mm-hmm. And then we say, what's the best can happen? You know, you and I are just the highlight of everybody's day today. You know, everybody, geez, those two, I don't know if I can even work the rest of the day. I'm just so charged up by what. The worst can be saying, gee, is there something on the other channel? And I hope this doesn't last too much longer. And so you kind of talk about just what you want. And in that part of the impact filter, I'm just selling myself on the project before I get anyone else involved. So I always have a feeling that I shouldn't try to sell something that I'm not sold on myself. And that just saves an enormous amount of time, because anyone who gets an impact filter from me knows I'm 100% sold, or I'm not going to waste their time. And then I say, if this is going to be successful, then this will be true, this will be true, this will be true, this be true. And so there's lots and lots of very creative people getting involved in this world because it's easy to get involved with it. The barrier to entry is zero. The cost of entry is zero. Really, I mean...
There's so many companies popping up in the space. When I was down at the conference in Orlando, it's just, there are so many who's available to do the hows. Going back to the strategic coach concept of who, not how, there are tons of people who can fill in all the blanks for you. And like Dan said, the barrier to entry for a podcast to launch one yourself, it's never been lower, because maybe a few years ago, you would have had to invest a bit of time in trying to figure out some of the technology, some of the audio editing stuff. And people who've been doing this for a long time, like myself, take for granted sometimes that maybe it seems quite simple. But for people who don't have a background in this, there are companies available out there right now with a simple Google search, and you can really find all the help you need to get started in the podcast space. Suvi.
Tom would like to know, when you're starting out with your podcast, how often do you recommend putting out an episode?
I would suggest that twice a month is optimal. There are some people who do weekly shows, and that's great too. As much as your schedule allows for, I think that is going to be the schedule you stick with. Some shows are monthly, some shows are twice a month, some are weekly. There are people who do daily shows. There are people who do the 5-minute every morning. They just blast it right out. Whatever you have time to do and whatever feels comfortable for you. I mean, it's going to be essentially a full-time job if you're an entrepreneur and you're doing, you're building your business. You might not have time to do a half an hour long form interview every single day. But to put them out as consistently as you possibly can, I don't recommend waiting more than, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. Yeah. That's getting a little long, because one of the things we've learned when you really dig into the data is if you go long stretches of time without publishing anything, there's only so much real estate on your device. And if you see that there's a show that hasn't had an update in months upon months, well, someone's going to tell you about a new show, and that's going to take the space of the show that hasn't been updated in a while. Consistency is the key. If you do a monthly show, and that's the agreement that you've made with your audience, and they expect a show every month, then that's fine. They're going to expect that every month I'm going to get an episode of this show. If it's bi-weekly, that's fine too. But consistency is the key. Just make sure that the agreement that you make with your audience stays true throughout the duration of the show as it's being published.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is a crucial part of my development of my business, and I just treat it like I do, what are the things that I continually do on a regular basis in my business, and I said this is just going to be the next thing. I do workshops, I write books, I do videos, and everything else, and I just consider it part of my business schedule. And I have to tell you, the learning that I had to do. I was born in 1944, and this is a different world. I have to tell you, and this I'm really telling you that I'm an old guy here, and that is when people said, well, it goes into the cloud, and I said, the cloud? Where's the cloud? And they said, well, it's not actually a where, it's something else. And I said, well, what happens when the cloud fills up? And they said, well, it doesn't actually fill up, So I'm telling you some of the adjustments that I had to make. But then you begin to realize that I'm just talking to friends. I just consider it that I have friends, and I'm going to keep them up to date with my latest thinking, and I'm going to get feedback from them, because there's questions that we won't get to because we're shooting for about 30 minutes here. But we'll look at the questions and say, gee, that's a really interesting question, or an observation, and it's a learning process. So I always feel that as long as I have this regular pattern, it's going to be reciprocal, and I'm going to come up with new ideas, and other people are going to give me new ideas.
And further to the cloud doesn't exist. It's just somebody else's computer. That's what the cloud is. It's not going up anywhere. It's just going to somebody else's computer.
I'm shocked with that statement. I don't, I don't know. I don't know if I can do anything after the show with the.
Ooh, boy.
Yeah.
So we were talking about the coach clients.
No Santa Claus. Wow.
Uh-oh. We were talking about the new clients that are coming into Strategic Coach, and you brought up this concept that I thought was it was clever. You were saying, geez, people are listening to so many of these shows. They're coming into our program, and whereas before we had to start them out, essentially they're starting out at home plate. You said people are marinated in the tools and the language and the concepts of coach. It's like they're starting on third already.
Yeah.
How do you feel the podcasts have helped as people are coming into the program that they already know essentially what to expect and they already know where to begin? That's been a pretty significant benefit.
Yeah, I think, people want new information and they want new knowledge, but I think that there's a step before they're willing to accept knowledge and information, and that they have to feel a relationship. So I always feel that what I'm really, really doing on the podcast, and with your help, we're doing it much better than we were, is that I'm forming worldwide relationships with people who their first, the first part of that relationship may stretch over a year where they listen to 30 podcasts. And they're just testing out. And my feeling is that we know from the manipulation of visual technology now that people are saying, I'm getting fooled more and more because they're doing things on television and on the internet that are kind of fooling me. And I think we trust our listening more than we trust our vision. And so the podcast is really nice because people are listening to the tone, they're listening to how things are being talked about, and they develop a sense of trust for that. And it's a big world, it's a global world, but there's untrustworthy people out in the world, and they're looking for people they can trust. And I think that the more you just show who you are as a person as your prime communication. And that's, when you joined the, you took us up on the offer of becoming our podcast manager. It was actually one podcast that I did that we gave, and I should say this, that we had 4 people who applied for the job, but Gord was the only one who actually listened to the podcast. And one of the podcasts where I was telling a story about what I'd learned from my father, and I was really, I was very complimentary of my father, but I said there were some things about the way my father ran his business that was a lesson to me, but it was kind of a negative lesson. And he said, wow, boy, he says, you were really forthcoming there. And I said, well, it's my story. Everybody's got a story. And I'm not trying to present myself as something other than what my experience has taught me.
Yeah. That's one of the things that podcasting can do for you as well as an entrepreneur. You're building relationships in your sleep, essentially. The greatest compliment that you can give to a broadcaster or a podcaster, and I hear this, people tell me this about Dan, and I heard this myself throughout my 10 years on the radio, was when people would approach you and they don't know you. Even better than you're funny or this thing was clever or I like that thing that you did. When people say, I feel like I know you. People say, I feel like I know Dan already because of the intimacy and the stories that he tells and the trust as well. There's that element of we're much more likely to trust someone if we feel they trust us as well. So that element of reciprocity, but somebody has to go first. So you, on that episode of Multiplier Mindset, you really went there. You put out that information about your family, and you didn't really know how people were going to react to that. You didn't know if they were going to hold it against you. You didn't know if they were going to kind of snicker behind your back. But to those who really absorbed that story, I think the level of trust that they had for you after that would skyrocket because you decided to go there first.
We're acquiring the ability in this century with our technology to have relationships across the globe like they're next door neighbors, and it's, it's a really interesting world for me to be, doing this, in my 70s. And but I find very comfortable with that because I grew up in a small town. I grew up on a farm, and you're very comfortable with the fact that you have people you really know. But here, the technology is allowing us to do that at a distance in other time zones as if it was happening right in the room here.
We're just about ready to wrap up. Dan, any final thoughts as we wrap up today?
I just want to thank you for, all the, the structure and actual, the real organization of podcasting that has backed up everything that we were already creating, but it's just, I mean, we're kind of a big deal. You know, you went to Orlando and you said, you know, you guys are kind of a big deal in the world. Well, we want to be a big deal. It's just that we're very passionate, and I guess if you're passionate about this, you're going to be well known. That's all I can say.
So the best part about our podcast network, if you haven't had a chance to join us or take a look at it, you can visit strategicpodcasts.com. It's on your own schedule. You can listen to us when you want, and it's free, and it always will be. So check us out at strategicpodcasts.com. Thanks again, Dan, for joining me today.
Yes. And Jen too, no, I really appreciate it, and you know, I hope you know, we get some podcasting careers launched out of what we've shared this morning.
Me too. That would be a lot of fun.